Republican Congressman Joe Barton of Texas. He is on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, and Democratic Congressman Joe Sestak of Pennsylvania, who sits on the Armed Services Committee. Thank you, gentlemen, so much for talking to us.
Good to be here.
Glad to be here.
Congressman Sestak, let me ask you first, President Obama hasn't said much, but if he does, the question is, could it really make much of a difference? What do you think?
I don't think it's going to make that much of a difference. Here's what's very ironic. The leaders of Iran have actually engineered an exact situation with the preconditions necessary for a quiet velvet revolution. To think that the United States can all of a sudden interject itself into this relatively closed society and better engineer this mass uprising, I think is very strange. Second, we only have two important reasons to speak. One is to make sure that everybody understands we're concerned about the legitimacy of a democratic process. And second, the concern for the safety of the people. The president's done that. Let this revolution, which is for the first time questioning the legitimacy of the supreme leader, continue to unfold.
So then, Congressman Barton, do you think it's important to just essentially cautiously be watchful right now if you were the president?
Well, I think American presidents in the past have always spoken out for freedom, whether it was President Reagan asking the Russians to tear down the wall in Berlin, whether it was President Bush in Tiananmen Square, whether it was George Bush who said that let freedom ring in his second inaugural speech. I don't see the downside of our current president, President Obama, simply standing for all the past principles that we've had and say we want a free election, we want the votes to be counted. It's pretty ironic that they announced the winner within hours after the polls closed, and it's obvious from the demonstrations that a lot of people that voted for the opposition feel like that their vote wasn't counted.
Congressman Sestak, couldn't President Obama put pressure on China and Russia not to accept Ahmadinejad as Iran's president, considering China and Russia are Iran's major trade partners? I mean, if their oil, gas, and other deals were in jeopardy, could that possibly make a difference?
I think he should speak up about not against Ahmadinejad. He should speak up about the legitimacy of the democratic process and bring other nations to speak towards that. Here's what my experience is. Pre-Shah, I actually, in the Navy, operated on board my ship, as well as at sea, with the pre-Shah Iranians. They never forgot how we interceded in Iran in 1954 for a coup that overthrew their democratically elected prime minister. And since then, before I got out of the Navy 3 years ago, I operated with the Iranian Navy at sea. And so I find that there's a very professional group of moderates in that country that also very much believe that as a Persian nation, they are a self-serving nation in terms of they know what's right for themselves. So let's not overdo it in a culture that, quite frankly, we don't understand very well.
All right, but we need to understand it, I think, in order to have any influence whatsoever, I would think. Congressman Barton, I mean, tomorrow when Congress and the President get back to work, will lawmakers on Capitol Hill press the White House to take a hard line? I mean, they have passed this resolution supporting the demonstrators in Tehran. That's a pretty hard line move.
Well, Julie, we're not talking about military intervention. We're talking about just plain face standing up for freedom. Nancy Pelosi and I passed the bill in the House after Tiananmen Square that allowed the Chinese students that were currently studying in the United States to stay in the United States. And President Bush, the first President Bush, was totally supportive of that. So we're not talking about sending in a Marine Expeditionary Force. We're simply saying that freedom is freedom everywhere in the world. And as we've shown with Twitter and all the internet connections and cell phones, there are lots of Iranians who want to be just as free as their friends in Iraq and their friends in the United States and all over the world. And we and our president should be standing for that, not debating semantic points of diplomatic protocol.
Okay, well then continue on that thought then. We should be standing for that. So then what should the president be doing? Is there something you believe the president should be doing that he's not doing?
Well, I think for one, he ought to demand that all the ballots actually be counted. Former President Carter
do you really think that President Ahmadinejad is going to say, okay, President Obama, we'll recount the ballots? I don't think so.
Well, you asked me a question. I mean, former President Carter has led U.S. delegations under the auspices of the United Nations in elections all over the world to make sure that the election was honest. What makes the Iranian elections so different that we couldn't have an international group go in and check the ballots? The candidate that lost the election is appealing through whatever the process is in Iran, but it's a pretty, as has been pointed out, it's a pretty closed society. Why not open it up and have some transparency? That's one thing. Yeah. And the second thing would be to I just don't feel like President Obama has given us his best pitch so far, to use a baseball metaphor. He's still trying to throw a few change-ups. He ought to be throwing a few hard balls. And again, I'm not talking about military intervention, right, but you are seeing with we have got a free society now in Iraq, which is right next door, and the winds of freedom are blowing throughout the Middle East. This election in Iran is an example that, people want to be free wherever they are, right, and our president should be standing for that. And right now he's trying to act like he's an assistant secretary of state for Middle Eastern affairs.
Congressman Sestak, I'm going to allow you to respond to his comments, and then I'm going to have to wrap this up.
I understand. Look, past is not always prologue. I understand the point about China. But this is a country where its supreme leader holds legitimacy and has up until now in the eyes of the entire society. For the first time, he's factionalized himself. For the first time, he's not an honest arbiter. And for the first time, we actually have a cleavage in there that the people themselves of Iran, who still admire the supreme leader and don't want outside interference, are beginning to move us towards an orange, a velvet type of revolution. The president should speak up for the legitimacy of a democratic, free process and justice. To go beyond that will not let this play out to where afterwards we actually have a strategic opening to deal with that country better.
All right.
The president's doing it well.
That's all the time we have, but you guys were great. Congressman Barton and Sestak, thank you very, very much for talking to us.
Thanks for having us, Julie.
All right, Greg.